Hi everyone, welcome to my channel and to this video where hopefully I can share some tips for painting soft and fluffy blankets, something that has featured in so many of my pet portraits over the years. If you enjoy this here and find it helpful, then please do subscribe to me here on YouTube and check out all of my other playlists. I have tons of free videos for you to get started in soft pastel. And then if you would like even more tuition, join me over on Patreon where you can access my full library of real-time tutorials and lots more. In this short video, I want to share some tips with you for painting other textures around the pets in your pet portraits. Because quite often I've had to create soft textured blankets, cushions, dog beds, cat beds, all sorts of textures that go in these lovely pet portraits. I am going to use this, my most recent portrait of little Jack, the one-eyed Jack Russell, to demonstrate now how I went about building up this texture. So I'm just going to use the front section of this blanket to show you the entire process, where I make a start and how I build up these layers. So the first thing that I'm doing here is with black, and I am blocking in with more black in the shadow areas that I can see on the blanket, and then just a very thin little layer. What I want here is just to darken the whole blanket area and prepare it for the next colors. So I've used pure black there in some of the darkest shadows, and then I come up in tonal value just a little bit with this, my darkest purple value. And I'm pretty much just using the pastel mostly on its side and blocking in this larger area, preparing it for the lighter colors. So the main key here is to not fear those darker colors in the lower layers. What I'm trying to pick out are the dark colors that I can see in between on the blanket. So whatever my darkest values I can see are, those are the first ones that I come in with. And that's whether I'm painting a fluffy blanket or whether I'm painting dog's fur. For me, it's always the same technique, starting with the darks and building up to my lighter colors. So in this moment, I was experimenting a little bit just to bring in a little bit of warmer color now, to mix some other kind of color into my purples. And I'm putting this warmer, lighter color down the parts of the blanket they're going to be most highlighted later on. However, I didn't really continue with that plan. I could have done without doing that at all because, as you're going to see, I cover it right over. But I'm always doing that. I'm always experimenting with colors, seeing what more I can add to bring that extra sense of realism and light to the picture. So now I'm back in with the harder black new pastel stick. Any hard black pastel stick would do the same job. And you can see here that I'm kind of scribbling. That's how I can best describe this, because what I want to do is create the bubbly texture of the blanket. And so I'm just scribbling with the black there, leaving these little circular gaps. Nothing is too uniform looking. It all looks a bit random, a bit haphazard. And then in the next layer, I can start to bring in some color now and making use of the darker values that I've put down, making sure that these marks that I make now allow those darker colors to shine through. So for me, it's always about finding the dark contrast underneath first, and then building those other colors on top of that. So this dark 14 color, it's just a little bit lighter than my darkest purple value. So I'm creeping up gradually through the tonal values, Another big tip that I can give you is to not make too much of a leap between your tonal values. Try to use several colors that are pretty close in tonal value. So make smaller steps in tonal value when you're adding new layers of color. So, what I mean by that is don't jump straight from the black layer to a really bright highlight color. Make sure that you've got some of these other tones in between. That really thickens the effect. And just like when you're painting animal fur, it just makes it look like it's got more depth to it. And in the end, just makes it look more realistic. So with the dark 14, I can kind of add this right across the blanket because it's still pretty dark. I'm keeping in mind though where I want those darker shadows on the folds of the blanket to be. And I'm really making use of the bigger pastel sticks here because I can get bigger, broader marks from my pastel sticks. And if you've used soft pastel sticks, you might have noticed that it's actually quite difficult to get really repetitive, uniform marks from your pastels. Because you're wearing the pastel down as you use it, you tend to get different shaped marks each time. And for something like this, that's ideal because the last thing I want is for this to just look like I've added uniform dots all over the place. So my pastel sticks really lend themselves to making these very natural looking broader marks, which is exactly what I'm after when I'm painting a blanket like this. So that's a good layer of the dark 14 in. And then I pick up my slightly darker purple and I'm just adding a bit of that back into those darker shadow areas. You can see just to the right of the folds on the blanket, we're getting a bit of shadow there. So I get all of those dark layers in first before I start to pick up any of my lighter colors. And so now with additional 34 and as you'll see soon, a bit of grey 8, both very similar in tonal value, but also not overly bright because I would describe this colour as quite a mid-tone colour, and the same here with grey 8. Quite a mid-tone colour, and these two colours will be my brightest highlights on this blanket. So like I mentioned before, make sure that you don't make too big a leap between some of your tonal values. So this color isn't that much brighter than the dark 14 that I used underneath, but it's bright enough to show up as a highlight. It's bright enough to make it look like these areas are catching more light. And now I really aim those highlight colors just in those places where the blanket is picking up more of the light. And you can really see that as I build up the layers, you start to see that light just filter across the blanket. So I did speed some parts of this up just so that I could show you the process overall, but I can tell you that this blanket in total took me about 45 minutes to 1 hour. So not a crazy amount of time to create something that looks quite detailed. But at the same time, I'm always reminding my patrons over on Patreon to slow the process down, especially when it comes to background elements. We often try to rush through these final parts of a painting, but in actual fact, really you should try to slow your process down and give these other elements in the painting just as much of your time and focus as you did to the main subject. So, towards the end, I can come back in with some of my darks. I also do a little bit of blending here. You can see I'm not rubbing it really hard, but I'm just softening the marks ever so slightly, just like I do when I'm painting fur. And I can even pick up a blender just to redefine some of the darker areas in between. Finally, a little tip for blending. Here I am literally just tapping. So rather than blending and rubbing and perhaps losing some definition, just giving it a little tap like this can also soften the effect. So, to be honest, I probably could have gone maybe one or two steps lighter on this blanket from what I'm seeing in the photo reference. Perhaps some of those brightest areas could have gone just a little bit brighter, and I could have continued just picking up a slightly lighter color each time. I made the decision in this case to not do that, to keep the blanket a little bit more muted, keep it more in the mid-tone range, and really let the brighter colours on little Jack shine out from this piece. You'll notice that I also injected a lot of blue violet type colours, purples, really rich purpley colours into this blanket, whereas in the photo reference it's a much more dull looking grey colour. So don't be afraid to take a bit of artistic license, both in creating the general sense of the texture and in your color choices. So there's really just a few key things to keep in mind when you're working on textures like this. Make sure that you're starting off dark enough with enough contrast in there to let the lighter colors show up. Try to use some colors that appear somewhere else in the painting. And just on that note, here's another little example of where I've used the blue violets. I've changed grey into a warmer, more interesting tone, making use of these lovely blue violets. So play with your colors, pay particular attention to your tonal values, and always try to simplify what you see, because sometimes you don't have to put in as much detail as you might imagine. So I hope that you found this helpful. If you would like to access the full real-time tutorial of Jack, the Jack Russell, that is now up and available on my Patreon channel, where you can watch the entire painting in real time. You've got the color codes popping up, you've got my narration all the way through to help you out. But I hope that you've enjoyed this short version today, just focusing on soft blankets, as I know that that is something that many of us struggle with. And it's particularly useful for those of us who love to create pet portraits. So I ask you again, please do subscribe here on YouTube if you have enjoyed this or found it helpful. I would also like to just quickly mention that I am back on Instagram. So if you previously followed me on Instagram, you might have noticed that I disappeared last November. My account was hacked. All of my channel was completely deleted. And so I'm starting from scratch on Instagram again. So if you previously followed me there and you're missing my posts on Instagram, please do go and find me again. Just search for Emma Colbert Art again and follow me. But thank you very much for watching this here today. And until next time, happy pasteling.